Hello, everybody. Fantastic to be here. Sorry about the delay. I'm really enjoying everything so far. And there's still so much to come, isn't there? Got to admit, super excited for Mike Carr's keynote later on, the 2020 World Champion of Public Speaking. Anybody else looking forward to that? I mean, turn your camera on. Let's have some cameras on if we can. But yeah, I mean, very, very much looking forward to it. And actually, I spoke to Mike yesterday and congratulated him on his big win in 2020. You've probably seen it. I told him I particularly enjoyed the movement and energy he had in that winning speech. It was amazing. And he said, well, Dan, I wasn't responsible for all the movement and energy. So I said, well, what do you mean, Mike? And he said, well, just between you and me, I'm a very short man. Now, it's true. Mike is very short. He's 3'7.5". Anyway, he said, between you and me, I'm a very short man. And on the day of the final, even the lowest setting on my camera tripod was too high for me. These are the problems we have in the virtual world. He said, only the very top of my head was showing. So I said, wow, Mike, what did you do? Did you stand on a box or something? He said, no, I couldn't have moved like that. I couldn't have had all that energy if I was on a box. He said, a good friend of mine let me climb up on their shoulders and they carried me for the entire speech. I know, but it's true. It's true. I'm going to show you. You can actually see the point. If I switch this camera, you can see the point where Mike, there you go, almost falls off. Let's see, I mean, spotlight if you need to, whatever you need to do there, but Mike almost falls off there. Let's come back to me. So I said, that's some friend, Mike. That's some friend. What kind of a crazy person let you sit on top of them to give a whole speech? And Mike told me he's always remained very tight-lipped on this. He's refused to ever tell anybody who carried him that day. I mean, obviously, mainly to protect the dignity of the carrier. But I've managed to get hold of some secret footage that was filmed on the day of the finals. And I've got a screenshot which reveals the identity of the carrier. Let's have a look. Shall I share that as well? I mean, you might not know this person, you might not, but let's have a look. Ready? There we go. Linda Marie Miller, second place in the world, and she did that after carrying Mike for an entire 7 minutes. I mean, well done to her. I think you could tell that her shoulders were a little bit stiff during her speech, but excellent job. Well done, Linda Marie. Anyway, enough of that nonsense. Sorry. Now, I know some of you are here just for the jokes. If you haven't already worked out, there aren't going to be any. I suppose this is more of a bring your own jokes kind of a session. Okay, it's not like you've even paid, is it? So anyway, so how about this? I'm going to put my phone number in the WhatsApp chat, my WhatsApp number, sorry, in the chat, my WhatsApp number, and you're going to send me your best jokes. Now there's going to be more content before then, but maybe when we get to the breakout at the end, we can read out some of your jokes. That might be fun. I mean, they're bound to be better than the ones I've got. So let's put my number in here for you all. Dangerous, but there we go. Okay, and don't worry, as soon as the session's over, I'm going to delete your numbers, block you if I need to, and maybe alert the police. But let's see, there we go. You've got my number. So, and please keep them short and clean. Please, short and clean, like my car. Okay, let's get started. 4 minutes in. What can you do to better engage your online audiences and keep them interested and entertained? It's not easy. For me, it's about the humor. When your audience are laughing, you can be sure that they're engaged and enjoying your talk. So why don't we all use more humor more often? Well, I keep hearing the same two reasons from people that I work with. They'll either say, I'd love to add humor, but this particular talk, it just isn't suitable. It's not suitable for humor. They say it's too emotional, too sad, too serious. I've even had someone tell me their speech is too boring for humor. Or they tell me they'd love to add humor, but they've tried and nobody ever laughs. Nobody finds them funny. And I get that a lot. Now, in 2009, I found out my second child was on the way, which was great news, but it did come with some worry too, because my first child, Emily, had been born profoundly deaf. Now, there was no real explanation why she was deaf, but there was a suggestion it could have been genetic. So on the day of the 3-month scan for the next baby, I was feeling quite anxious and nervous, a little bit uptight about the possibility of having another child who might have the same struggles ahead. And I remember the grainy black and white baby scan image coming up on the screen, you know, the type they used to have. And the only thing that was on my mind during what should have been a happy moment was will this baby have hearing loss too? And I remember I pulled the nurse to one side and I said, my 4-year-old daughter is profoundly deaf. Can you please tell me if this baby will be deaf too? And I remember she gave me a perplexed look and she said, well, do you have any names for the baby yet? I said, well, we don't have any names if it's a boy, but if it's a girl, we're going to call her Eloise. So she walked over to the monitor and started banging on the top of it, shouting, Eloise, Eloise. And nothing happened. No change, no movement, total silence. And then she turned and looked at me and said, well, fingers crossed it's a boy. And then she laughed and said, I'm sorry, but your baby's ears aren't even formed yet. We've got no idea right now. Now, 13 years later, I've got 2 daughters, Emily and Eloise. And the big worry I had back then, well, it's meaningless now. Emily is profoundly deaf and she wears cochlear implants. Eloise has perfect hearing, unless I ask her to tidy her room, obviously. But it wouldn't make any difference either way. Of course, I wouldn't change either of them. So 13 years on, it's not the worry that sticks with me. None of that means anything anymore. What sticks with me is the humor the nurse showed. Just the humor she brought to what was an anxious situation, the warmth and lightness of touch. And often it is the humor that stays. Now, of course, you don't want to disrespect a serious topic, and that means that when we're dealing with sensitive issues, we need to be very sensitive and very careful about how we add humor. But we can always add it. That nurse, she didn't start telling jokes about people being deaf. She didn't make light of the disability. She playfully made light of my lack of common sense. And she smiled and was gentle with it. It was impossible for me to be offended. Now, of course, there are much heavier subjects we might be speaking about than hearing loss. So a few years ago, I was asked to give a very serious talk, and it was about the worst sporting disaster that happened in the UK. I know some of you are from the UK. In 1989, 97, football fans were crushed to death at a football match. And there are so many tragic stories from that day, so many. I think the one that hits me hardest, maybe with my own personal circumstances, is a dad who took his 2 young daughters for a day out and lost them both. And so many of the victims were so young. And I was giving this talk because Liverpool, where the disaster happened, is my hometown. Liverpool were the team that were playing that day, and the victims were Liverpool supporters. And there was no question that this was going to be a very serious, very somber, and very difficult talk to give. And in a situation like this, I agree. There's no room for adding humor for humor's sake. And you shouldn't be adding humor so that people find you funny. It's really not about you as the speaker, especially when you're dealing with topics like this. But no matter how heavy and serious your talk is, the audience, they need some lightness. They need something to bring them out of the despair they'll feel as they listen to all these tragic stories. So I remember I thought back to my and he said, "Sir, can we pray for Liverpool to win the big game tomorrow? I'll be there. I've got my ticket." Okay, Andrew, let's all pray for Liverpool to win the big game. But my clearest memory is what Andrew said next. Sir, I've got one more prayer, if that's okay. Okay, Andrew. Can we pray for my Auntie Mary's canary? Your Auntie Mary's canary? Yes, sir, it's gone. It escaped from its cage and flew out through the window while poor Auntie Mary was asleep. Now, I was Andrew's cousin. His Auntie Mary was my Auntie Mary. We definitely had an Auntie Mary. But I knew for a fact she never had a canary, never. And I remember Mr. Clark looked at me for confirmation because he knew I was I was star pupil. I would never lie. But it was so funny. I couldn't help it. I just nodded poignantly. Okay, then, Andrew, well, I'm unsure about this story, but let's all pray for the safe return of Auntie Mary's canary. And so 30 11-year-old boys and one fully grown man spent the final hours of their school week praying for a canary that never existed. And then that weekend happened. The disaster unfolded. Now, luckily, Andrew didn't go to the game. It was another one of his tall tales. He was safe at home. There was only one person who'd stood in that classroom and prayed for that non-existent canary who'd gone to the game. And it wasn't one of us 11-year-old boys. It was Mr. Clark. And he survived as well. But he had to stand and watch helplessly as people around him lost their lives. Now, somehow on Monday morning, he managed to get into school. And as usual, we gathered for registration and prayers. And we prayed for the victims of the tragedy. And there were 2 boys in the class who weren't there because they had family members who hadn't made it. And when we finished praying, Mr. Clark asked if anybody had anything personal they wanted to pray for. And Andrew's hand went up. And he was in tears, real, genuine tears. And he said, "Sir, Auntie Mary's canary, it came home yesterday." And this time, Mr. Clark didn't miss a beat. He said, "Well, that is good news, Andrew. Let's all be thankful for the safe return of Auntie Mary's canary." And we all laughed through the tears. And even when I think back to that dreadful, dreadful weekend and all those awful things that happened, it's that gentle humor of an 11-year-old boy and the warm smile of an incredible teacher that sometimes comes to the surface. That's one of the memories of that weekend. And that's where I found the lightness and just a tiny bit of humor in the talk I gave. It was away from the tragedy, but also deeply linked to it as well. It was gentle humor that hopefully added to the poignancy of the speech. So I think you can and should always try and add humor to any speech you give. Be careful, be respectful, don't ever be cruel, not in a speaking environment when it's away from stand-up comedy. Okay, so we've decided we want to use more humor when we speak. How can we do it online? That's why we're here, we're online. How can we make people laugh when they're sat by themselves in an empty room, often with their camera off? Now, there are two big things. Firstly, I think you have to somehow bring the audience together. And secondly, you have to be you have to be yourself. So let's start with the bringing people together side of things. Now, back in the 1950s, when people first started to use TVs, comedies were the most popular form of entertainment on TV. Audiences loved to watch a good comedy, but in the comfort of their own home. Now, in those early days, there was one big problem with that. The audience weren't sure when to laugh. They weren't together with people anymore. They weren't getting those cues. So producers came up with the idea of adding tracks, laughter tracks, canned laughter. We all know that, which would not only tell the audience when they should laugh, it would also give them that feeling of togetherness they were missing by being at home alone. And for online humor to work, you've got to do something similar. You've got to bring the audience together. Now, I'm not suggesting you should add a laughter track to your talks. Please, please don't do that. I saw somebody do it. Please. It was funny, but for the wrong reasons. When we first went into lockdown back in 2020, remember how amazing it was that we could travel the world and speak virtually or watch speakers virtually? And we can still do that now. There are so many opportunities. But back at the start there was one day when I got an email asking if I could come and evaluate the speech of a Toastmaster. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Toastmasters, I assume most of you do, an evaluation is something that follows a prepared speech. So the speech will last for 7 minutes or so, and then the evaluator will come up and talk about what went well and what could be improved next time. So anyway, I agreed to go to this virtual meeting on Zoom and give the evaluation. Now, the meeting was happening in Canada and I was in London. So it was going to be a 1 a.m. start for me. And I remember I got an email from the speaker with some information about her speech, which I skimmed over, as you do. Her name was Jessie. It was her first speech. And she wanted to talk about her all-time idol, Neil Armstrong. Fine. Jotted down her name, jotted down the speech title, Wonderful World, and the objectives for the speech. It was an icebreaker, easy. I even prepared a clever little conclusion, pre-prepared a clever conclusion. And then I shut my laptop and I forgot about it for the rest of the day. 1 a.m, I logged in for the meeting and I remember feeling just a little bit sleepy as Jessie was introduced onto the virtual stage. And I remember telling myself to stay focused on the speech. Next thing I hear, wow, what a great speech, Jessie. Fantastic job. Why don't we head straight over to our special guest evaluator, Dan Magill, all the way from London. We're excited for this. Are you there, Dan? Now, I hadn't heard a single word of the speech. And there I was, pinned in my pajamas. What could I do? Pretended to be on mute. Dan, we can't hear you. Carried on. What a great idea. It was before the days of fake mutes went widespread. This'll work, I thought. But no, because right then, my cat jumps onto the desk and starts to meow. Dan, we can hear the cat, we can hear the cat. Now, at this point, people in the audience are crumpled up laughing because they know that I've just faked the mute. So I started. What a speech Jessie gave us today. Why don't some of you tell me what you like best? Wasn't happening. They all knew what I was doing. Some of them were laughing so hard there were tears at this point. Well, Well, that brings me to my first recommendation. I thought Jessie could have used more of her screen. Now, true story, in the corner of my eye, I see a message pop up in the chat window. Does he realize Jessie is a guy? One lady was laughing so much, she turned her camera off. And when it came back on a minute later, she was wearing different clothes. Okay, I needed to get out of this quickly. What did I know? I knew it was an icebreaker. I knew it was about Neil Armstrong, and I still had my pre-written conclusion. So I went for it. For Jessie, this may have been one small step into his living room, but it was one giant leap for Jessie's confidence. Good. Next day, I got an email from Jessie. Hi, Dan. Thanks for the evaluation. Really appreciate it. I loved your conclusion. But you do know my speech was about my hero, Louis Armstrong, not Neil Armstrong. Now, I might not have done it deliberately that day, but I definitely brought the audience together. They were all laughing together. And they were together because the humor was happening in front of them. It was literally unfolding in real time. It's not easy, but see if you can find ways to bring your audience together when you use humor online. Play with the audience, maybe make some jokes about people who are in the room or somewhere nearby at the time. Don't be cruel, keep them kind. Talk about things that have happened so far, maybe. Use callbacks. Try to involve the audience as much as you can. And try and make them as much a part of the humor as you can. If you're telling a story, do what you can to make the audience feel like they were there at the time. Ask them questions. Maybe get them to send you jokes. Don't give out your phone number though. Don't ever do that. No, we won't have a look yet. But find ways to bring your audience together, and they will laugh. They will laugh. Okay, so that was number one, bring your audience together. Now, the second thing, equally as important, is to be yourself. Try not to over-rehearse humor. It needs to sound real and honest. It does need to be you. I think there's nothing an audience dislikes more than feeling like they're just being spoken at or manipulated into laughing. So try and keep it natural, keep it as off the cuff sounding as possible, and keep it you. And if you're a Toastmaster, you might want to cover your ears for this bit, but use filler words. Do it. Toastmasters, they get trained to stop using filler words like buts, and so. And I understand that for some people, they need to work on that because they could use a filler word every other word. But when we remove them completely, we can lose that conversational, off-the-cuff, authentic tone. And I think it affects humor more than anything else. So the first thing I learned when I started doing some stand-up comedy was to put those filler words back in, just be a bit more natural. Let's finish with a quick story about the value of being yourself online. We have time, hopefully just. I mentioned my daughter, Emily, my first daughter, who's profoundly deaf. Now, when she was 4, she was given cochlear implants, and that means that she does have access to hearing. But she's still a deaf person. She's 16 now. Actually, she's 16 today. I'll be in trouble for this talk later. But last year during lockdown, she was given the opportunity to present to the class via Zoom. Most of her classmates didn't take the opportunity, but Emily did. And the teacher told her she could take as much time as she needed. Fantastic. I offered to help her put something together, but she said no. She said she'd seen my talks and I was the last person she needed to help. Fine. She did let me sit in the room with her on the day, just in case she needed help with anything technically. So I did get to see the presentation. Now, as she logged into that virtual classroom, I was more nervous than I probably ever have been about any of my own talks, literally shaking. And she was first up. And I'm thinking, oh, I wish I'd helped her. I wish I'd told her what to say. Anyway, she started. Hi, I'm Emily, but as you all know, I answer to M. Well, let's be honest, I'm deaf. I don't usually answer, do I? Especially if you stood behind me at the time. Now, every person in the room was laughing with her. Immediately, as soon as she started speaking, she had people laughing. She carried on. I know we're supposed to leave questions until the end, but the batteries in my cochlear implant, they don't normally last that long. So please go ahead now if you've got any questions. Now, one young chap puts his hand up. He says, Emily, what's the best thing about being deaf? And she thought about it for a moment and then said, being allowed to jump the queue at Disney World. Good question, good answer. Now, her teacher came in off mute and said, really, Emily, they allow deaf people to go right to the front of the queue at Disney World. That's fantastic. She thought about it again for a second and then smiled and said, well, I don't really know. I always bring along a wheelchair too, just to make sure. Now, I know people were in hysterics, but I know that's not necessarily the most proper joke ever. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there are people out there who do fake disabilities to get to the front of the queues. And that was who the joke was about. So it was fine. Anyway, it looks like we're in our last few seconds. So I'm not going to get a chance to quite finish 100% now. But oh no, we've got 118 seconds. Great. Okay, perfect. We can finish in that time. So where was I? Yeah, as I was saying, people like that do exist. And I think it's okay to make a joke about those people, isn't it? I think so. The point of that story is that Emily, right at the start of her talk, she used humor to overcome the discomfort that she or any of the audience were feeling about her disability. She was completely herself. She was completely real. And an audience love it so much when we use that kind of self-depreciating, real humor. It relaxes them. And after using humor to relax the audience, Emily found it much easier then to talk about the real difficulties that being deaf can bring. She spoke about how hard it is to understand what happens in the classroom sometimes. And she spoke about how hard it is to make friends and how scary the silence can sometimes be at night when she's not wearing her implants. And it was really powerful, and the audience were hanging on every word. They were mesmerized. And then she finished by telling them about the time her dad sent a text message to his new boss at work, saying he'd be late because his daughter was deaf and needed new batteries. But predictive text had changed it to say his daughter was dead and needed new batteries. And again, she finishes with the whole room laughing. And I realized that my 16-year-old daughter was far, far funnier than me. And quite possibly, I might be biased, but it was the best speech I'd ever heard.